everyone. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Plus 9 to 1 Heritage Talks, third webinar on behalf of architect Marvi Mazhar. Apologies, she wouldn't be here to open the session as she had a flight to catch. And last minute, she had to change her plan. So, on her behalf, myself, architect Tanya Sumro, who is also a close ally and advisor to Pakistan Chowk Community Centre, and here to introduce the session to you. So, PCCC is an organization which has worked very hard since 2016 to be an advocate towards built environment, safeguarding public spaces, and establishing a strong stance towards preservation. Pakistan Community Centre strives to provide a space for community engagement, advancements of art, culture, and democratic and literary discourses in Karachi, especially focusing on urban infrastructure and preservation discourses. Now, this talk plus 9 to 1 Heritage Talks is a project of Pakistan Chowk Community Centre, conceptualized and developed by architect and spatial advocate Marvi Mazhar herself in 2023, where every year PCC hosts a discussion and webinars dedicated to the politics of heritage and preservation of South Asia. This webinar is later viewed by students, researchers, and urban thinkers because after the talks are done, the recordings will be uploaded on the YouTube channel. So this talk is an innovative South Asian perspective which unveils radical discussions through yearly student-led curated series on an open online platform, bringing different practices together. PCCC works hard to bring academics, bloggers, independent researchers, artists, architects, urban planners, policymakers, anthropologists, journalists, and fiction writers to come together to think about development, infrastructure, and ecology. And it's my immense pleasure to open the third session of Plus 9 to 1 Heritage Talks 2025. The topic for this year's webinar is Post-Colonial Narratives in South Asia. So before any further delay, I would now like to introduce PCC's this year's team who worked very hard to put this project together. So team is based on Marvi Mazhar herself, Syed Samil and Sana Wahid, whereas the documentation and coordination is carried out by Shaheen Noman, lovingly known as Auntie Shaheen, who puts a lot of hard work in carrying the Heritage Walk Karachi project for students, researchers, visitors, and our very own whistleblowers from the field. Now, we cannot begin without acknowledging this year's dynamic team who worked extremely hard on various sections like research, creativity, social media, and community strategy. And their names are given as Syed Samil from Karachi University, Sana Wahid, Indus Valley University of Art and Architecture, Asad Zafar, Karachi Grammar School, Ishal Hassan Khan, BNU, Faiz Siddiqui, Karachi Grammar School, Siham Dadabai, National College of Arts, Asadullah Rajpur, Indus Valley School of Art and Architecture, Kissa Ali Jafri, Indus Valley School of Art and Architecture. So before we start the session, just very small and quick SOPs to discuss. Number one, I request the audience to keep their mics on mute. If you have any questions, please leave it in the chat box and our moderators will pick up from there. When speakers finish presenting, we will open the space for audience to interact and share observations and questions. Usually speakers share work for 15 to 20 minutes. Our moderators will give a signal when 12 minutes have passed and give another gentle signal around 15 minutes. Session is recorded and will be uploaded on our YouTube channel later on. I now welcome moderators Asad Zafar and Siham Dadabai to open up our first exciting session that is titled as Architecture, Modern Heritage and Urbanism, Space for Power and Identity in South Asia. So over to you, Asad and Siham.
Thank you, Tanya, for the introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the Plus 9 to 1 Heritage Talks 2025. I hope you're all doing well. My name is Asad, and I am one of the moderators for this session. We really appreciate everyone for taking out their time on a weekday so that they could be here. I'd now like to introduce the topic for our session: architecture, modern heritage, and urbanism, spaces of power and identity in South Asia. Following independence, South Asian nations embarked on ambitious architectural and urban planning efforts to express sovereignty, national identity, and a vision of modernity. These post independence projects were deeply symbolic. State funded monuments and newly planned urban centers were designed to break from colonial pasts and project an image of progress and unity to both domestic and global audiences. Foreign architects and planners were often invited to contribute to these visions, bringing with them internationalist ideals that resonated with modernist aspirations of the time. Yet these developments frequently relied on inherited colonial planning frameworks and global design ideologies that privileged centralization, uniformity, and state authority. In Pakistan, the modern movement unfolded primarily in the Western Wing, reinforcing political and cultural dominance while sidelining the diverse regional and linguistic identities of the East. The disconnect between symbolic representation and lived realities created lasting tensions across South Asia. But these same modernist tools came straight from Western planning traditions, raising the question: can a city designed in the style of a former colonializer ever fully escape its colonial roots? Chandigarh's concrete landmarks and Islamabad's orderly grid may signal progress, yet they also reproduce patterns of top down control and hierarchy, imposed as much for political symbolism as for habitation. These capitals never truly developed, keeping the people in mind, and today the growth of informal settlements, such as slum clusters on Chandigarh's fringes and migrant villages around Islamabad, alongside evictions in sectors like I-11, remind us that spatial inequality still mirrors those inherited colonial divides. This session explores how post independence architecture and planning became tools of nation building, but also of exclusion. By revisiting the spatial legacies of this era, we seek to understand how these physical forms continue to shape collective memory, contested identity, and the unresolved narratives of decolonialization in the region. That was the brief for today's session. I now invite my co moderator, Seham, and request her to please introduce our panel for today. Over to you, Seham.
Thank you, Asif, for the kind introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome such a distinguished panel today. We're truly grateful for our speakers for taking out the time to join us and share their valuable insights. Joining us today are Anoma Pieris, Ammara Maqsood, Nihal Perera, and Sahr Farooq. From architects to anthropologists, each bringing fresh perspectives on architecture, modern heritage, and urbanism from diverse contexts across South Asia. To kick off our session, I'm pleased to introduce Anoma Pieris, a professor of architecture and associate dean research at the Melbourne School of Design. Anoma's training is in architectural history and in geography, with a specialist focus in post-colonial and subaltern studies methods as applied to the architecture of South and Southeast Asia, more specifically to Sri Lanka and Singapore. She has published widely on issues of nationalism, citizenship, and sovereignty. Her publications related to Sri Lanka include Architecture and Nationalism in Sri Lanka, The Trouser Under the Cloth, and Sovereignty, Space, and Civil War in Sri Lanka. Her recent books include the multi-authored Immigrant Industry, Building Post-War Australia with Len Horiuchi, The Architecture of Confinement, Incarceration Camps of the Pacific War, and the anthology Architecture on the Borderline, Boundary Politics, and Built Space. Thank you so much for Anoma for being here today. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shiham, Tanya, and Asad for that introduction. And I'm just going to now share my screen and go to my talk. Right. So I'm going to talk today about decolonization and the way we interpret decolonization, because I have been thinking about the different ways that we look at it and the way it changes over time. So in 2022, Colombo witnessed a 9-month-long urban encampment known as the Aragalaya, Sinhalese for struggle. I'm not going to really talk about the Aragalaya here, but what I want to say is that in the process of having this encampment in the middle of the central business district, which was the colonial city, former colonial city, what we became aware of was we became aware of the difference between the lived reality of the majority of the people and the way the city was being developed. And what was interesting about the Aragalaya was that many of the tents and facilities that were created were the civic functions that were absent from the city. This is what I call a decolonial protest, a protest that is actually exposing the inequities that are pervasive in the development of the city. So I'm trying to understand how decolonization can be reframed after this encounter, after our realization of these inequities in such a pronounced way, through a kind of architecture of solidarity, which brought Colombo's citizens into the streets. There are different ways that we can think about decolonization. And there are many interpretations, which I won't go into in detail. There is the suppression of Adivasi life force. There are the hegemonic imperial cultures that we identify with, Buddhist, Hindu, Mughal, and British empires. The struggles for self-determination and independence. The internal intersectional social divisions that are in our societies. The competing interpretations of modernity. But in the framing of this particular session, the Western influences that are encouraged, rejected, or reworked. So in the years preceding and just after political independence in Sri Lanka, many local architects trained in India or Britain joined the Colonial Buildings Department and began to integrate particularly indigenous elements into their designs. And indigenous in this sense is not First Nations, but in terms of Buddhist, Sinhala aesthetic motifs that come from monastic cities, monastic traditions, palaces, temples, etc. And you can see them up on top. And this is a university and the Independence Hall. At the same time, during the 1960s, during the period of the Cold War, when concrete was introduced for the big reservoirs that were being built, it entered into the building industry, and it produced a kind of architecture that we are all very familiar with, that is a kind of industrial modernism. The OPEC oil crisis of 1973 created a crisis in the building industry. It impacted transportation globally, and the nation embarked on a policy of import substitution that forced greater self-reliance. So the image that I show you are two types of decolonization. One which is looking at iconic aesthetic reflections of particular cultural expressions, and the other which is a kind of modernism that is trying to speak to international audiences and changes. So Sri Lanka's pioneering architects navigated these tensions differently with contrasting formal and aesthetic solutions. They were challenged to shape emergent and often internally conflicted modern subjectivities. Their responses were linked to their personalities, social station, gender, and Western education. The possibilities and tensions of decolonization are embodied in their work. Now, I imagine that you all are familiar with these architects, but I'm going to go through them very quickly, the three main so-called pioneers. Mina de Silva reoriented from European modernism, learned at the Architectural Association in London, to a more culturally and climatically sensitized understanding of place. Her exposure to Ananda Kumarasamy and the 43 group of artists, as well as a close friendship with Le Corbusier, inspired modernist translations of simple village structures. Her aesthetic evolved over the years from clearly modernist principles to those dominated by the vernacular plan. However, her gender and location in Kandy limited her opportunities. The only substantial public building she designed was the Kandyan Art Association Centenary Cultural Centre, built after many years away teaching in Hong Kong. Emphasis on self-reliance inspired architect Geoffrey Bawa to look to local resources and ways of building. He partnered with the Danish architect Ulrik Plesner, whose humanist tradition valued vernacular construction practices. Together, they reintroduced courtyard building traditions into metropolitan and elite housing. Bawa's design approach is best conveyed in the Osmond and Ina de Silva house, built between 1960 and 62. Bawa's influence soon overtook his contemporaries, consolidated by a commission for the Sri Lankan Parliament completed in 1982. The building won him global acclaim. His architecture shifted towards resort architecture, where picturesque ambience and regional forms were desired. He would set a regionalist trend across Southeast Asia. Examples here include the Triton Hotel in Ahunggala and Batu Jimba in Bali. Valentine Gunasekara was a casualty of the decolonizing aesthetic. His dedication to modernism was solidified by a visit to North America in 1965, where he met many American architectural luminaries. He experimented with an approach inspired by California modernism, using the sectional volume as his primary design tool. The desire for a clear break from the feudal past reflected his middle-class social status and client base. He used modernism to democratize entrenched social hierarchies. He designed small chapels for the minority Catholic communities, and the largest complex designed was the Tangala Bay Hotel. His break with traditional forms and aesthetics alienated him. Each of these architects set out to reinterpret and represent Sri Lankan architecture, and each was focused on specific values and in turn selected to suppress or reveal Western modernist legacies. Their client base varied from elites to government or middle-class clients, but rarely touched the lives of poorer citizens in a society still shaped by a colonial class system. Growing up in Sri Lanka, I was rarely exposed to architect-designed homes. For me, the most resilient experiences of decolonization came from a major political event that was staged in Colombo in 1976, the 5th Non-Aligned Summit. In the remainder of this paper, I want to describe the summit as a vehicle for decolonization of a different kind. The non-aligned movement, NAM, was created following the first summit in 1961 by a group of countries unwilling to take sides in the unfolding global Cold War. By the time of the fifth summit in 1976, there were 85 member states. Each international gathering produced a constellation of facilities, often funded through aid relationships and prepared many years in advance. In her inaugural address at the summit, Sri Lanka's then Prime Minister Sirimao Bandaranaike, Mrs. B, identified economic imperialism as the new global challenge. The summit logo was of two hands, black and white, breaking their shackles to join in a handshake against the backdrop of a map of the global South. Mrs. B's government and that of her husband, SWRD Bandaranaike before her, systematically alienated Britain and her allies by forging political relationships with US-embargoed Soviet bloc governments, including Communist China. Pursuing neutrality and diversifying foreign aid, they rejected economic liberalization as constraining decolonized socio-political agency. The United Front government idealized self-reliance and introduced rent control, land reform, nationalization of industries, and other sweeping measures that imprinted socialist ideals on the citizenry. The Colombo Summit's unfolding temporal geography was underscored by strategies of decolonization that incrementally oriented the expectations of citizens towards self-determination. And here the summit motorcade route, which I have drawn here, collects along it key institutional buildings. The city's east-west arterial, Buller's Road, after a British agent, was renamed Bauddha Lokamavata, meaning the light of the Buddha in Sinhala, and it led to the summit venue. 2 gigantic sculptures were erected. A concrete cast replica of a 12-meter-high Buddha sculpture from north-central Sri Lanka, and a bronze likeness of SWRD Bandaranaike sculpted by Soviet realist Lev Kabel. This was erected overlooking the parkland fronting the Colombo fort. But alongside the symbolic gateways, auditoriums, hotels, and improved highways, there were the cleanups, evictions, and land appropriations that such events inevitably bring. The citizens of the Republic lined up each morning along the route of the slow-moving motorcade, hoping to glimpse the summit's international delegates. They were enthralled by the vehicles, precious commodities in an era of import prohibitions, two-toned Honda Statesman sedans, French Peugeot 504 saloons, and Joseph Broz Tito's 6-door Mercedes-Benz. So-called summit cars became a status symbol. The sultry inter-monsoon weather was hardly a deterrent to an expectant population enjoying unusual proximity to international leaders along the city's narrow streets. Anwar Sadat, Indira Gandhi, Muammar Gaddafi, Kenneth Kaunda, Archbishop Makarios, Marshal Tito, and others glided by, flanked by outriders, the lodestars of a post-colonial generation of flag-waving children. I stood at a point somewhere midway along this route, along with excited family members, vicariously enjoying our internationalization through NAM. Dependencies that weaken NAM autonomy was also legible along the motorcade's route. Illustrious guests were accommodated in modern, American architect-designed multinational hotels. Hotel Ceylon Intercontinental, completed in 1973 under a different government, demonstrated the US's growing regional hegemony. Others included the Indian-owned Hotel Lanka Oberoi, designed by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and the ubiquitous Holiday Inn. Although contrasting with colonial hotels that had dominated the city, they saw American economic imperialism as decolonizing hospitality. International journalists were accommodated at red brick maisonettes known as the Summit Flats, the first such middle-income housing scheme for government employees. Instead of removing existing colonial government bungalows, they repurposed their gardens, keeping the historic layers in place. The delegates' destination was the Bandaranaike Memorial International Conference Hall, designed by the Chinese architect Dai Nianse. Completed in 1973, this grand edifice was Prime Minister Zhou Enlai's gift to Sri Lanka. China thus embedded its footprint in the nation's development trajectory. The hexagonal building form was derived from the pavilion at the Kandyan Royal Palace and Temple, but its elegant lines were a direct translation of India's US Embassy by Edward Durrell Stone. Summit architectures prefigured development processes that marketization would accelerate. Poor management of the looming fiscal crisis, a presentiment of the country's current dilemma, cost the standing government the 1977 election, and the country voted in economic liberalization with a 4/5 majority. It was Japan that founded the parliament, completed in 1982 at Sri Jayawardenepura, a new administrative capital in the island's interior. This too was an act of decolonization, of indigenizing government, but as a highly securitized island complex. If we return to the scene from the Argalia, some elements from the summit can be recognized. They include the Hotel Intercontinental and the Bandaranaike statue. Symbolic architectures introduced to the city since, with China aid and loans, dominate the skyline, including tower and theatre projects shaped like lotuses, the political emblem of the then incumbent and much maligned Rajapaksa leadership. They appear as the vanguard of neoliberal transformations seeking to seamlessly integrate Colombo with other global places, stripping them of their particularity. colonialism in a different guise. And here you see on the scaffolding for the new port city in Colombo seamlessly integrating into Beijing. Colombo is projected as magnificent and affluent, the place that is recognized internationally because it is a mirror of the West. But unlike in the case of the summit's architecture, the aesthetic is unfamiliar, and through its proliferation, erodes citizens' urban belonging. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anoma, for your lovely insight. So if anyone has any questions for Ms. Pieris, please drop them in the chat. We're going to address them shortly. Till then, for our next panelist, we welcome Ammara Maqsood. So Ammara is an associate professor in the social anthropology at University College London. Her research centers on questions of middle-class religiosity, kinship, and intimate aspirations, and on how these entangle with larger questions of class politics and belonging in urban Pakistan. This work has appeared in various leading journals, including American Ethnologist, Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute on Environment and Planning, and has led to the books The New Pakistani Middle Class and Lahore in Motion. Her current work focuses on questions of religious difference in non-secular contexts and is funded by the ERC grant Multi-Religious Encounters in Urban Settings. Thank you so much, Ammara, for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully do it without any big mishaps. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for this kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this session. I'm going to talk about the themes that Asad had highlighted in opening the session through the publication of our recent book, which is Lahore in Motion, edited by myself, Chris Moffat, who's a historian, and Fizza Sajjad, who's an urban planner. And it's open access, by the way, and I've included a link here for you to access it. And I'll use kind of the themes of the book and tell you about the book to address some of the themes that have been coming up in the session. So the book's written for a wide audience, and the contributors of this book are not just academics, although many of them are that, but they're also artists, they're activists, and they're journalists. And the book is organized around 26 stations of the Orange Line Metro, which is a 27-kilometer mass transit line that connects the northeast of Lahore to its southwest. And it started in 2015 and largely financed through a soft loan from China and completed in 2020. And for most of its path, it takes the form of a viaduct, so you can see its elevated tracks from on the roads from the city, and it kind of casts this shadow of a viaduct over the city. And what we did in this book was that we asked each contributor to pick a station, or we assigned them one of the Orange Line's 26 stations. We asked them to take the Orange Line to the assigned station, to walk around the neighborhood, and to write about what they saw. We kind of gave them this thing about, imagine that you're guiding a reader through the neighborhoods in the shadow of the viaduct, right? And to kind of just give you a little sense of what that journey, I mean, some of you here might be familiar with this journey and might have done it yourself, but just to give a sense to others about what it would have felt like was something like this. We've used this format as a way to have these kind of different voices, 26 contributors with their own perceptions about the neighborhood, to illustrate the complexity and contradiction in Lahore's urban landscape, something that I think even when you just sit in the Orange Line and you have this kind of vantage point as you sit in it, you can see the contradictions in Lahore's urban landscape. And we tried to kind of have this present in the book by making it intentionally multivocal, so the 26 people, it jumps back and forth across time. It is open to tangents, fragments, and impressions, as opposed to any kind of authoritative statement or comprehensive account. In other words, what we tried to do with our format and the multivocality it engenders is to engender that with our theoretical and methodological thrust, which is to approach the post-colonial city as a forum of frictions and to use the orange line, or we can say infrastructure, large-scale infrastructural change more broadly, as generative sites for these kind of frictions to play out. And I don't want to go into like all the theoretical stuff around it, but we're very much guided by Anna Singh's concept of frictions here, to think about infrastructure as a site, as a generative site for these frictions of the post-colonial city to play out. And to tell you about how we arrived at this idea about thinking about the post-colonial city as a forum of frictions, but also to see them play out, to see infrastructural change as a site where these frictions play out, I just want to go into a little bit of background and focus on two aspects of how we arrived at this. Sorry, let me just move away from it. So one of them was just to kind of coming from the infrastructural change that has taken place in Lahore more broadly, right? So Lahore, we know, is the second largest city in Pakistan. It is home to 13 million people. And the face of Lahore has been transformed in the last 2 decades through large-scale infrastructural change, and the ruling party, Pakistan Muslim League, has played a very important role in it, which is and largely this infrastructural change has come in the face of building underpasses by large and wide roads. And this is something that other political actors have then followed also. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, that how this kind of infrastructural change or this overall trend is very much seen as this kind of the Dubaiification of Lahore, right? An attempt to emulate the kind of glitzy, in-your-face tall buildings and the huge endless highways that kind of go into the horizon that we see characteristic of a certain kind of modernist growth in the UAE. And it is true that mega development projects in Lahore have come largely in the face of roads. The Lahore Ring Road, for example, is an example of this, which is an 85-kilometer, 6-lane highway, which now encircles the city. And not only does this promise like very fast travel to car users, what it has also done is that it has allowed Lahore, so the expansion of Lahore through suburbanization and through areas at the periphery of Lahore to be developed as residential building. And all of that has been facilitated by this large scale road infrastructure project, right? And just to kind of get a sense of the growth of Lahore and the way that has expanded through these through these road projects can be like seen through this map that I have over here, and that's been enabled by projects such as the Ring Road. And this urban expansion has not been matched in any way in an increase of public transport provision, which largely continues to take the form of buses, wagons, rickshaws, king cheese, but it's overcrowded, it's very challenging to use, and it's very under-resourced. And we can see that in the absence of good public transport systems and growing distances, dependence on motorized modes of transport has increased, right? So we can see through this graph over here that there has been a 163% increase in motorized vehicles. And of course, like access to this kind of privatized mode of transport, we can say correlates directly with class and with gender. So who can afford this kind of motorized transport and who can't? And we find that government policies have continued to focus on car users over pedestrians, even though the majority of the population of Lahore are not car users. And this is not only then sort of the infrastructure development and the focus on roads and cars is classed, it also contributes to this huge environmental crisis as well, right? So Lahore is one of the most polluted cities in the world. And it's actually against this kind of backdrop that in 2013, the Punjab Mass Transit Authority had inaugurated the first bus rapid transit corridor in Lahore, which provided a dedicated right-of-way for buses with long sections built on a concrete viaduct. And it was the first large-scale project developed for the sake of public transport provision in the city. And very much similar to what Anoma was talking about earlier, this was very much presented as a gift to the people of Lahore by the ruling party. And it was like, it was, said that this is like a tofa for the people. And it was very much linked to their re-election in 2013 in the Punjab provincial elections, because it was not only a gift to the people, but it was like done very quickly, made in almost 10 months. And it was exactly this kind of thinking, that construction, that paved the way for the Orange Line, which is the second priority mass transit corridor identified in Lahore's urban transport master plan. And unlike we find road infrastructure projects, the need for mass transit projects in Lahore continues to be heavily debated in a place like Lahore. And the criticisms of the disruptions that are caused by the construction to traffic, but also the aesthetic implications of elevated roadways, is very much overlapped by this resilient class stigma about the use of public transport, right? So the BRT corridor, which is cut off from the main road to avoid traffic, is often referred to as the jungla bus or the caged bus in a very derogatory way. And these criticisms have been the loudest in upper middle class circles who don't rely on public transport and have been the least affected by the construction of this, and are also the least likely to rely on public transport. And so the Orange Line is kind of marred by the similar kind of politics, and that's something that I want to discuss to show how we came to the idea of thinking of the Orange Line as a generative site for frictions, right? So when the construction for Orange Line started, it was mired in a series of controversies, protests, and disgruntlements. And the chief amongst them was that to facilitate the construction of the line on the intended route, local residents and shopkeepers and small businesses were evicted from the area where the Orange Line was going to pass through. And so between 2015 and 17, these evictions took place. And the second was a massive legal challenge, which was brought on by civil society activists and heritage campaigners, which also managed to successfully pause construction for around 15 months due to fears that the new metro would cause irreparable damage to several legally protected heritage sites along its path. And what we find is that the Rasta Badlo campaign, which was the campaign to change the way for those who don't speak Urdu. The Rasta Badlo campaign, which was led by civil society campaigners, architects, did point out rightly that there were very serious flaws by which the contractors had managed to secure the no objection certificates from the State Department of Archaeology that was allowing the metro to pass so close to several key heritage sites in Lahore. Ultimately, the Supreme Court had argued that actually these heritage sites have already been under risk because construction of residential areas has been so close to these sites anyway that they're not protected, or that kind of structural risk has already been that they have already been compromised in that way, and so the construction of Orange Line is not going to hamper them any further. But what we were particularly interested in is that how these heritage and civil rights campaigners had formed a relationship with the residents who were also evicted and were also fighting the construction of the Orange Line. And this kind of relationship between the two was by no means a very straightforward one. In fact, it was filled with a lot of tensions. And these tensions came from they stemmed from class differences, that the civil society activists often came from upper middle class backgrounds. They did not live in the areas where the Orange Line was going to pass through, and neither did they largely ever rely on public transport. Meanwhile, the residents of the affected residents were very differently exposed. First of all, some of the areas, particularly around Anarkali, but also in Parachute Colony, were predominantly refugee families who had come into Lahore at the time of partition and had been granted evacuee property. So property that they did not have papers to, right? And so therefore they felt very much at risk, and the kind of the intimidation by the Lahore Development Authority made them feel even more vulnerable when they did not have these papers. And I feel that the civil society activists were very much trying to help these residents, but at the same time, they were unable to understand the positions of the working class people that they were trying to speak for. And Fiza and I have written about this previously, that the way working class groups in the city have been able to deal with the authority and power of the local state has been through these shape-shifting ways that often involve compromise, often involve a give and take. And ultimately, the decision of these residents to accept the compensation that the government was offering them rather than to resist eviction, which the activists had wanted, was seen as a big failure. But that failure had to do with their different class positions. And also, there were contradictions between the residents themselves, right? So many of the residents that we interviewed absolutely did not want to leave the areas that they were being evicted from. And very similar to going back to something that Anoma had briefly mentioned, the way that Colombo is being developed, that people in the center of the city from Varte have been moved to high rises at the periphery of the city. These moves also mean a risk of livelihood, right? Because people work in the center of work very close to where they live. And so these evictions were not only going to mean that they are losing their neighborhoods, but they're also losing access to sources of livelihood, sources that, connections that they have also depended on. And several residents felt exactly like this. But there were also other residents, and often people within the same family could not agree, that some people had always been wanting to move out of these overcrowded areas. But because they did not have the papers, because these were evacuee properties, they could not sell and move on, right? And so there were contradictions amongst them too about whether this eviction is going to lead to some kind of better promise, or allow them to do something that they'd always wanted, or come at a huge price. And at the same time, what we realized through our interviews with these people is that many of them also use public transport, right? And they are not people who reject the Orange Line as something that should not have been made at all, but just that they should have been very much part of the decision-making process, and they wanted their voices to be reflected in the final path that the Orange Line was going to take, rather than say, like, our city absolutely does not need the Orange Line. And so it was exactly these kind of tensions and contradictions that made us think about how actually large-scale infrastructure has a very generative quality to it, in that it brings out the frictions that exist within the post-colonial city, and how these are very much absent from mainstream and dominant narratives about neoliberal infrastructural change. And particularly, I think there's this narrative of how we talk about infrastructural change in post-colonial historical cities like Lahore, is that this kind of large-scale foreign change coming and disrupting traditional ways of life and being. And Lahore, I think, being this historical city, but also Lahore, which is a site of a lot of nostalgia for post-partition Pakistan, because it's a city that lost so much of its religious diversity at the time of partition. It's very susceptible to kind of nostalgia that the past is always better, right? And then in that kind of existing nostalgia about the city, these kind of large infrastructural changes are often seen as like they're completely disrupting the traditional ways of life. But this kind of narrative does not really reflect the unevenness that is existing within the city, that change is experienced by different people in different ways, as our example through how the different people who were active in speaking out against the Orange Line were being affected. And also this kind of assumes a particular kind of very unilinear narrative about what large-scale change often looks like. So if, for instance, we say contemporary neoliberal change in Lahore, but in post-colonial cities more broadly, is reflected in the fact that there's large-scale speculative urban property buying that leads to the construction of these big, residential housing authorities, often at the periphery of the city, and that is how the city starts growing, and it subsumes what is agricultural land into urban real estate land, right? Which is true, which is exactly how neoliberal change happens. But when we go back and look at the history of Lahore, we realize that even in the 1890s and early 1900s, this is how Lahore was growing. And Patras Bukhari, for instance, in his satirical essay, Lahore Ka Geographia, says that once you had surroundings of Lahore, now Lahore is surrounded by Lahore, right? That this is how the city has always been expanding. And even when we go back to looking at papers from right after partition for the Lahore Improvement Trust, you can see that the city is growing by acquiring peri-urban agricultural land at the peripheries of the city. And so this kind of development that we now say, oh, this is neoliberal change that is destroying traditional Lahore, does not take into account that actually traditional Lahore was also developing in exactly the same way. And so this is not to say that these ways are right or just, but it's just to say that the post-colonial city is very uneven. And it is uneven in a way that these kind of large-scale narratives of change do not match how change is being experienced locally. And we need to pay attention to exactly these kinds of frictions to understand how class, gender, but also the personal and the intimate is so entangled with the political. And so this was our attempt to bring these kind of debates and this idea of friction into academic debate, and we've done this through this format of the book. It's by no means perfect because obviously, although we've tried to pick diverse contributors, most of those contributors are familiar with speaking in English, do come from middle-class backgrounds. But even in this kind of similar-ish class demographic, you can see very different relationships to the city and very different relationships to change. And that is, I guess, the message that we were trying to bring. I'm going to stop here and hopefully I can answer or talk about more themes through my answers and the questions people ask.
Okay, thank you so much, Ammara. Really interesting take on infrastructure and how these infrastructure can act as spaces of power, kind of inflicted and forced on us. And so we might not have time for question and answer right now, but if people do have questions, please, again, drop them in the chat and we will relay them to our speakers in the future because we have to move on. But thank you so much, Ammara and Anoma, for being here today. We really appreciate it. If you want, actually, you can address, there is one question in the chat. How can neoliberalism effect be reduced as capitalism?
Okay. Could I ask actually the person who has asked this
Yeah.
question to maybe explain a little more if they feel comfortable to just explain more what they mean by this?
Hi, can I speak?
Yes.
Yeah, hi, Assalamu alaikum. Just the point that there's neoliberalism effect after colonialism, and Lahore is a city which is being affected by neoliberalism. And then we see that capitalism is there and it's not going to end. So how do you see, uh, capitalism and neoliberalism being the very part of the narrative of the Lahore and going forward like that? It's just like uh, that's what I want to ask you.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I don't necessarily see, neoliberalism and capitalism to be conflicting, but I feel that we're in a particular stage of capitalism that's marked by particular kind of neoliberal changes. But I think what you're trying to say is that how do we think about the economic era that we're living in relation to the expansion of Lahore? I think the key thing to keep, and especially, I guess, coming out of how we were talking about infrastructural development, is to think about equity, right? And equitable redistributive growth and what that looks like. We don't need to give it particular kind of terms or grand ideologies either, but we can just talk about what does an equitable city feel like, one that speaks or one that addresses the needs of most of its residents, right? And to think about the needs of the city to be contested is perhaps one way that we can move into that direction and are able to answer some of these questions. But if you were to kind of ask me as this one answer to like, how can we get, what can we do in response to this, is like, for me, the answer is redistribution. And this redistribution is terms of spatial, economic, social.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ammara. That was just one question that we have time for. I'm going to introduce now our next speaker. To continue our discussion, we now welcome Nihal Perera. Activist, educator, scholar Nihal Perera is a professor emeritus of urban development at Ball State University, USA. The two-time Fulbright Scholar was a senior research fellow at the National University of Singapore and King Mongkut Institute of Technology at Lucknow, Thailand, Graham Foundation Fellow in the United States of America, Distinguished Visiting Scholar at the University of Alberta, Canada, and an Erasmus Mundus Scholar in Germany and Italy. His Fulbright Hays Awards are for CAP Asia, an innovative immersive learning semester focused on learning from communities and spaces in Asia through collaborative projects with local partners that he founded and directed from 1999 to 2022. An original contributor to the field of post-colonial urban studies, Professor Perera is a leading scholar of Colombo and Asian urbanism. His research focuses on how ordinary people produce spaces for their daily activities and cultural practices, not as victims of larger social structures, but as agents of change with transformative capacity. He has published articles and chapters on gender, race, development, Chandigarh, Dharavi, Gangtok, Kerry, and Yangon. His books include Decolonizing Ceylon, Transforming Asian Cities, People Spaces, and a special issue on development. He's been the chief architect planner of the Mahaweli project and a regional and physical planner of the Transmigration project in Indonesia. In addition to the USA, he's also taught in Germany, Hong Kong, India, Nepal, Rome, Sri Lanka, and Taiwan, and has researched in China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Asia in general. He teaches voluntarily off the grid, and his work is cited in over 70 countries. Welcome, Professor Perera, and over to you.
Okay. Yeah, let me do it this way. It's much easier. All right. So I'm going to kind of like very quickly, I'm actually going to move a little bit away from the two previous speakers, but I'm going to rush through the kind of like the first part. And the little statement that caught my attention from the announcements and so on was the unresolved narratives of decolonization. I mean, they are unresolved, and they will be unresolved in a big way. So and also I figure out much of our work, even in Ammara's, it was clear we are trying to find ourselves basically. So European colonial displacement is actually central to our identity. I'm not implying any authenticity that existed prior to colonialism, but because of that also, it's very important for us to have the right tools to investigate. And one of the struggles that I published in my first chapter called The Relevance of a Knowledge of New York, asking them to kind of like, okay, I'll write about Colombo and what do you think about New York using that? So one place's experience really doesn't really work in another place, in a strict sense. So the strategy was to view the production of the built environment from the place or the agents of production. I mean, this is exactly this really connects with the Chowk community in many ways. So I'm trying to learn from colonial, modernist, and informality, right? So I'll rush through the colonial first. The first thing that I realized in my research was the colonial, the Colombo, which is the capital of Ceylon, was produced as a part of the imperial network of cities in the Indian Ocean. So we can create our own stories, but the thing is, actually, it is created as a part of that system. And Colombo created Ceylon through territorializing the island into administrative and revenue districts. And then economy was overlain on that. And the biggest issue was the intellectual imposition. So all these things I have documented in the decolonizing book. So in a way, I'm really wondering, like the urbanization that we learn is also wrong, actually, because it never evolved. Colombo never evolved, and the system never evolved. So it makes me wonder, how do people even plan or develop cities without ever knowing the urbanization? So that is also partly why the interventions went astray. So so the big mismatch is this subjectivity, which is actually very much represented in this museum building, which is a British building in which the Ceylonese history is laid out, or Sinhalese and Tamil history, and it's a classic example, and with the governor's statue in front. So and after independence, people talked about, Anoma kind of like highlighted that the economic underdevelopment, urban inequalities continued, like the rich people had a lot more services than others. But in an intellectual sense, they were like a people without history. I mean, there's this book by Eric Wolf, I believe, Europe and the People Without History. So so we would have like the Cambridge history, as Ranajit Guha would call it, and then most of the history is from outside. Like, I mean, then the local historians like Kame De Silva would write like very linear history as the connecting to Europe. So understanding local phenomena using Western experience doesn't make any sense, because theories are produced through through experience. I mean, if you borrow theories, and nowadays universities first ask what is your theory before you even start. That means, like which experience you want to use, and that actually sends the study astray. Now, this is exactly why we see things like this. Here, I'm showing a bridge on the right-hand side to replace the bridge on the left-hand side, and it goes from nowhere to nowhere. I mean, there are huge number of projects in the world like this. And on the bottom left hand, there were boats given to people who were hit by the tsunami, like the who lost their houses and lives and everything. And I was asking them, you got boats. Why are you just drinking under a tree? Like you're not going fishing. They said, we don't know those boats, and so on. So obviously, like there are different kinds of fish, there are different kinds of boats, there are different kinds of fishing and so on, which the people who worked for them did not understand. And when it moves to so-called modernity and globalization, everybody talks about, talks about the central business district. They've totally lost track of the people living in the city, which is usually highlighted by so-called housing. And if I may highlight, this is a geography book, that one of the geography books in the world that justified racism, because when the Portuguese were in Asia, they were pretty much racist. Like everybody knew who they were. But the British would actually use the tropics to justify, because the savage comes from the tropical forest, as opposed to the white man who comes from the temperate area. So now it's you can't even change what it is, right? So architects would follow the same thing, like, so I'm going to move a little bit away from architecture, but architects would understand using European historical periods like medieval and Renaissance and so on. Architects as authors, like, I mean, I've highlighted this in Chandigarh paper, the critique of Chandigarh, and modernity, and these are the concepts that they would use, and tropical, which is actually a very kind of a racist concept. So can we understand building in a larger sense, from the place of production? That's the question that I've been raising, in my own work. And I really like to be invited by the Chowk community. So when we view from the place of production, I figured out that the approach, the focus, what are we looking at, the vantage points, from which side you're looking at. Are we looking at people, or are we looking from the side of the people? The frameworks, because if you use a Marxist framework, you will see class. If you use a feminist framework, you will see gender. So what kind of frameworks should we use? The pedagogies, how should we learn? So these are all very important. I mean, these are like documented in previous work of mine. So I would like to sort of like see whether I can go beyond architecture, but I mean, since this we are all trained in that area, to kind of like use that to see to whether we can go beyond. And Anoma mentioned about Jeffrey Barber. and also Minette, I'm glad she mentioned. So so we usually to focus on a known architect, but not as author, right? Not as author, but his journey. So what you see is like what uh, beyond what you're looking at. I know, like, is there anything beyond that? Like, I mean, in these, I mean, I can also see the interesting thing how the inside and outside is connected here. So in a way, the Bauer's work, there are lots of other dimensions like class, gender, various things, but from this standpoint, he would be actually questioning and breaking the nature-built duality, right? So nature is in the built and built is in the nature, right? And then it's the same, like a little bit more evidence here. And here also he brings in, like, he makes use of the hill, the rocks, the like all this nature, and connects with the nature as well, right? So this is actually called a borrowed landscape in Chinese landscape design. And these are in Asian approaches in a way, because building in the nature, into the nature, as opposed to like falling waters, for example, dumping right on top of the uh, mm, waterfall, right? I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's a different approach. And then inside out, so the inside never finishes. There are glass windows, and then there's and inside is air conditioned, like, and then you can come out here, and then you can move further and further and further. So it's breaking thresholds, like there's no one place from which one side is inside and the other side is outside. So these are the issues that we talk so much about in post-coloniality, right? And here, right under your nose, these things have been breached or experimented with. And here's another one, massing and terracing and so on, to kind of, like, connect with the outside. And this is also, this is like Ulrich Plessner actually built this place without ever drawing a drawing, because like, I mean, drawings came later, and later on some architects have actually picked up on this, because it's very hard to do drawings and in such places. And the feel, like, what do you really feel? So if I may move a little bit quickly, so I began to see from a local vantage point, rather than looking from outside, critical regionalism, there's modernism, it's regionalizing and so on. I see the emergence of some sort of hybrid modern architecture, local modern, right, architecture, which is capable of supporting contemporary functions through culturally comparable spaces with locally familiar or easily familiarizable aesthetic, right? So because you can never go to the past, like as both the speakers said earlier, and also there's no point in kind of like borrowing somebody else's experience. So how do you build in the place, in time and place, right? So there's a lot to be learned, but I'm not taking architect as author, like that's one way of understanding, but I'm using this term critical vernacular. Can we understand architecture from architecture itself, from the place of building, right? So when I say vernacular is not old, vernacular is from the place kind of thing, right? And Fatih, Hassan Fatih, an architect, you can see I'm little old, I'm older. So he always said every society had a signature, a physical identity, but that's not what I'm searching for, and then, if I may move beyond Baba, because I took that as an example. So Lu Tai Ke, he's the chief planner of Singapore during its transformation into so-called developed country or whatever. When I met him, he told me when he moved back to Singapore, he figured out the understanding of rain that he learned as an architecture student, like in inches and so on, in scientific ways, didn't work, because the tall building that he built leaked at the windowsill level. And the woman he knew asked him to cut the windowsill, and it worked. So he was kind of like highlighting to me, like, about rain is also cultural. So this is what we drop like in the West, like politics and economics, we give so much priority to those. And then Charles Correa told me when I came back to these are Charles Correa's structures, and he didn't. Anyway, Charles Correa told me that he learned that you need double defense because it doesn't, the buildings don't work like in the West. And so that doesn't mean that you have to be opposite of the West, but also at the same time, you cannot be the West. So we need to look at the right places and right things in the places to find this. And you can see, Charles, when he first built, I think Chandigarh was the biggest problem in architecture in India, and this is what he built. So much of a copy. He built fantastic things after that. I think so much related to the community and so on. And then eventually he became a literal what do you call? I mean, traditionalist, and so on. So architects don't practice the same architecture during their lifetime. So it's really ridiculous to sort of like use this author thing. And Hassan Fatih, when he could not find concrete and steel, he went to nearby New Gorna village, and he learned how to build out of clay. And then his whole career was built on that. And then in Samarinda, so what I'm saying is we need to look at, rather than architecture, we need to look at the places and look at the things that can teach us. And Chitraniyaga, I mean, this is almost like following a kind of like informal settlement, so he brought the market in, and then he also made it a little bit formal on the outside, right? This is in Samarinda, Indonesia. And Bandit Chulasai, he was trying to use Taitun. In Thailand, they raised the houses, up and the space underneath, but he was building a Taitun on the third floor. And of course, Laurie Baker and so on. So the another place, other than looking into this architecture, another place that we can look at is informality. This is on the left hand side is how the architects and planners and so on perceive and conceive a place, and this is how people live on the right hand side. How come we cannot even know how they're living, right? So I will show you something at the end about the Capisha program, where we took students for 20 years to communities to learn from communities. And my colleague, who's an architect, he wrote a book entitled Leftover Right Under, because these are leftover people building on leftover spaces using leftover material. I mean, that's how we conceptualize this so-called informal and so on. Because I think we cannot, I'll get to informal. So, and we need to learn how the powerless people negotiate, right? So, so informal actually, I've given an interview to a journal in India. Informal doesn't really exist. It's not, informal means the inferior other of the formal, right? Because and by that one would homogenize the informal and assume that the informal will become formal one day, right? Which does not really happen, right? Because this is the dilemma in sending people from so-called slums to flats, because the lifestyle in flats itself is a different one. The focus is on the salary and the monthly payments and the bills and so on, as opposed to people who live in the so-called informal settlements. Their focus is on their life journeys, right? So if we really want to understand heritage, that is heritage. That is how people have lived. We have brought in a formal into that and informalized the thing around it. So so when people focus on their life journeys, whatever we give becomes raw material. Now, after the tsunami, the NGOs and architects gave like totally designed houses with water and electricity. What people did was people just broke them, like from various sites and created whatever they want. So for them, they never got anything complete. So we are so much interested in a complete product as opposed to the process that we are getting involved in. So So the people would produce locality, right? People produce locality, right? Sorry. And I think there's a fabulous book by Sunila Ahmed, which addresses this idea of makamiyat. And then we studied a chowk, like I wanted to relate, like, I mean, in Sri Lanka, it's called a handia, like, I mean, these are the most important spaces that people use. The pola, which is the farmers market kind of thing, and so on. We studied, I mean, they're all in my People Spaces book. And we tried to kind of like understand going beyond these regular land uses and so on, right? And what we figured out was kind of like all these techniques that we learned, like the Nolly map and so on, does not actually talk about or tell us much about the real handia or the chowk that it's living. Now, in response to this, I said we created this program called Capacia, which is called the College of Architecture and Planning in Asia. I took students to live in a community in Asia to learn not how we see the environment, how they see the environment. And actually, when we figure out how they see the environment, we can reflect. And many of the students would come and say, like, Nihal, I didn't know I was that racist, and so on. So I think at the end of the day, because learning means we are changing. And I think much of the university education today is to make us even harder and harder and to build our ego, we knows. And when I go to critics in architecture and planning schools, they always say we need to teach the people. I said, you're still in school and you want to teach people, like, what about learning from people? So that I'll give you one small example to end this discussion and this presentation. So this was in Sri Lanka. We built this was there were two teams, Sri Lankan and my school, 2001, and they were supposed to build in wood and mud. This is the mud pavilion, this is the wood pavilion they built, but they were given a very small budget, and to kind of like to understand, like, I mean, how people build there, as well as how to conserve, and so on. So the wood people kind of like started building with this, and eventually with in this pattern. And this person in blue here, he was very angry one morning. He came to me and said, Nihal, you collected our money and you're not even giving our money. We need big hammers and crowbars, and we need to build this. They are really gung-ho. And said 3 hammers broke this morning. And we had actually hired a carpenter and a mason not to build, because students were building, but as consultants. So they can ask, how people build here and so on. So as he was blaming me and sort of like, he was furious, this guy was repairing the hammers, which had like wooden handles and metal heads. So they now sit here and watch this happen. And he comes back again, with a lot of energy and say, Nihal, they repair hammers here. I said, absolutely. Like, so just be careful, and try to learn how they do in this. That's the purpose of this visit, not for you to kind of like be like this great Americans who are going to show how to build. So and to learn and so on. So that was the journey. I will stop there, so we will have time. Eh? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nihal, Perera, for your incredible insight. We really appreciate it. Me personally, I really liked how you said instead of architecture, we need to look at places. And a lot of references that you showed, there was a lot of engagement with local natural elements and vernacular ecologies. And in the case of Luthiker, where you said rain is culture, I think the thought of how decolonization all boils down to locality is something that really resonates with us. And somebody in the chat also said, it is wrong to call our rooms living rooms because we don't live there, we live outdoors. So I think that also reflects that perfectly. And it's also really nice to see your grassroots on-ground efforts like Cap Asia. It's really nice to see those happening live in front of us instead of just these topics existing in an academic sphere. So if we have any questions for you, I think we'll.
I mean, we can get the other presentation also without delaying, and then maybe we can go for questions. Is that okay?
Questions at the end?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that we don't delay the next presentation. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so next up we have Sahr Farooq, and I'll introduce her really quick. Sahr is enrolled in a PhD program in Architecture, Building and Planning Department at University of Melbourne. Her doctoral research focuses on the understanding of gendered citizenship and women's social activism in South Asian cities that have inherited and are shaped by colonial and post-colonial urban planning legacies through a specific focus on Pakistan. Thank you for being here, Sahr. Over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Just give me a second and I'll share my screen. Are you able to see it?
Yep.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much again. It's going to be a bit of a departure from what has been discussed so far, but I'll make references to the broader topic in general. So today I'll be presenting a part of my PhD research, which is focused on Aurat March as a case study to analyze negotiation of gendered citizenship in post-colonial public space. I believe most of us here, most of you here are already aware of what Aurat March is. But for those who do not, I'll give a brief overview of Aurat March. It's an annual women's solidarity movement in Pakistan. And for anyone who might not be familiar with Urdu language, Aurat March translates directly to Women's March in English. So the primary objective of this research is to examine how women's collective action in public space challenges the existing masculinist frameworks that shape the gendered conditions of access to public space and citizenship. While the research recognizes gendering of the space is shaped by a multitude of overlapping structures, the research specifically focuses on the role that planning plays in shaping gendered space and gendered urban subjectivities. In case of Pakistan, the gendering of the public space and the emergence of the public figure as male is owed to complex overlapping of its colonial past and nationalist frameworks. The patriarchal, spatial, and social orders initially imposed under colonial rule were subsequently inherited by post-independence nation-states, where they intersected with socio-cultural and religious norms to sustain limited access of women to the public life. Various post-colonial authors like Partha Chatterjee, Lata Mani, and Sinha's work have discussed the shaping of the limited role of women in public and political space through a shared history of India and Pakistan, highlighting how women were written out of the politics and urban space, or they were discussed as symbols rather than active political subjects. Within this context, to make any claims for the right to the city and the marginal positions have to disrupt the hegemonic frameworks shaping the meaning of the public space. And Aurat March emerged to play exactly this role. Aurat March began in Karachi in 2018. The following year, it was also organized in Lahore and Islamabad. And since then, it has been held annually in these three major cities, usually on or around the International Women's Day. In some years, marches have also been organized in other cities, which you can see marked on this map. It challenges the existing androcentric frameworks by demonstrating visibility of women in the city through one, physically occupying the public space, live streaming of the occupation, and the circulation of the posters that invite women to participate in the march. And at the bottom of the slide, you can see the promotional posters that have been circulated primarily through social media and in some instances through putting them out in the public space over the years. Through the assertion of women's visibility in the city, the march attempts to challenge the dominant ideas about who belongs in public space and reshape how we see and experience the city. So while the march is held in several cities across the country, to understand the relationship between women's solidarity movement, and the negotiation of gendered citizenship, today I will focus particularly on Islamabad. As a post-independence planned capital city, Islamabad offers a valuable insight into how the state has imagined and imposed its vision of citizenship, and the contestations of this imposed citizenship by collective action in public space reveals the relationship between power, space, and citizenship. A little bit of a background regarding the spatial history of the city. Islamabad was initially conceived as a decolonizing project meant to symbolize a modern Islamic republic. However, as the city was planned and developed in 1960s under a military regime, this vision was overshadowed by the colonial spatial narratives, which emphasized the order and control over social engagement. The emphasis of order manifested in Islamabad's gridiron plan, and the emphasis on control was reflected in the Parliament Square, emerging as the city's most prominent public space. The two initial proposals that you see on the top of the slide over here, by Doxiadis and Louis Khan, the Parliament Square was envisioned as a site of democratic civic engagement. However, those proposals were ultimately rejected in favor of Edward Durrell Stone's design, which closely mirrored the spatial organization of Lutyens' colonial Delhi. At the bottom of the slide, this is the proposal by Edward Stone Durrell, and this is what Lutyens' Delhi looked like. Edward Durrell Stone's proposal, once implemented, enforced the separation between state and people, not only through the vast ceremonial lawns of Parliament Square, but also by fencing them off from public access, shaping it to be a space of state authority. Boulevard leading up to the Parliament Square was also used for military parades in the earlier years. The juxtaposition of uniformed soldiers marching on the boulevard with the backdrop of Parliament Square and the citizens seated along the edge of to witness the spectacle unfold reinforced the nationalist sentiments and paternalistic state-citizen relationship. Although originally designed for state-controlled spectacles, the space was redefined through mass mobilizations challenging state authority. While the state imposed regulatory measures to maintain control, these protest movements gradually transformed the space of state authority into a space of political resistance, though they largely remained Anglocentric. And however, in 2014, PTI's populist politics marked a significant shift as women participated in unprecedented numbers. However, their presence was legitimized through religious and familial narratives that upheld rather than disrupted the existing patriarchal structures. The question this raises is the same as the one Rashmi Verma asks: how sexually and culturally different bodies can be politicized as citizens without being privatized by other hegemonic structures. And within the context of Pakistan, Aurat March provides a fitting response to this question, as it creates a counter image that unsettles the masculine assertions of public space shaped by overlapping hegemonic structures. This counter image, shaped by women's collective action in public space, unsettles gendered citizenship and evokes the same discomfort as Rashmi Verma's figure of unhomely woman, a figure which is overlooked in the conception of modern urban space and perceived as out of place and challenges social expectations that confines her to the domestic space. It destabilizes the binary oppositions between home and the city, which define the post-colonial feminist citizenship. Aurat March's desire to shape a counter-image of a traditionally androcentric space of political resistance through its occupation by a women's solidarity movement continues a direct claim of women's presence in public space as a political actor. Through their temporal and corporeal occupation of the Parliament Square, the Aurat March challenges the state's paternalistic and patriarchal frameworks that shape both meaning and the image of the public space. Unlike the masculine flaneur, who wanders freely, the women in public, is always marked. The Aurat March confronts this unease and politicizes the very act of women's public visibility. Since 2019, Aurat March has marched in many instances attempted to march along roughly the 4-kilometer stretch from the Press Club to D Chowk. The significance of pushing to appear at D Chowk lies in the symbolic connection to state power and masculinized political authority has been highlighted earlier. The occupation by the march, along with the practices of its participants, becomes an act of reclaiming the right to appear, to be seen, and to act in public as political subject. It creates a temporal rupture in everyday gender norms by shaping a counter-image where women's bodies reconfine a space through collective movement, sound, and presence. D Chowk, a space historically dominated by male-led political movements, is reimagined as a stage for women to collectively declare their presence and agency as a political actor. In the context where to flaneur through the city or to commune as an act of resistance or celebration is seen as a privilege reserved for men, the Aurat March disrupts this logic as women gather in thousands to dance, sit, and speak, not only as an act of protest, but also as a performance of an alternate public space. By existing outside the respectable female scripts, the participants claim visibility as political subjects. However, such disruptions invite resistance from both the state and from religious conservative segments of the society. As the march grows each year, obtaining legal certificate, the NOC, to arrange the event becomes more challenging, with the police blockades frequently attempting to halt the event. Opposition also manifests in form of counter march under the banner of Haya March, where Haya March translates directly to Modesty March. The encounter between Aurat March and Haya March highlights how public space becomes a contested terrain where opposing visions of womanhood and citizenship are performed. As both groups assemble, their simultaneous presence, physically separated by police-erected fabric partition, made visible the ideological rift over who has the right to appear in the public and how. The Aurat March, through feminist solidarity and embodied presence, asserts a right to public space as a site of joy, resistance, and political agency. In contrast, Haya March advanced a vision of gendered public participation rooted in religious and cultural conservatism, framing visibility as something that must be regulated and justified. Ultimately, the physical and symbolic division of the space transformed the protest site into a battleground of competing solidarities, each asserting a different claim to the public space and right to shape its moral and political order. The counter-image of the public space, shaped by the embodied spatial practices of march, outlives the march itself through live streams, media coverage, digital sharing, and the discourse that it generates. As it challenges the dominant narratives about gender and space in Pakistan, it shapes new discourse about citizenship, public space, and women. My research aims to spatialize political solidarity of women in relation to their right to the city. In a city designed to exclude, the Aurat March, through women's collective action in space, creates a hopeful space. It insists on the right to appear, to speak, and to be heard, not once, but every year. And in doing so, it renegotiates women's urban citizenship in Pakistan. Thank you, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Sahr. I think everything you said is really important. I think it's important to keep confronting the invisibility of women on the streets, and how something as mundane as a street now becomes a representative of gender politics and skewed power dynamics. It's very interesting to think about. And now, if we have any questions for Sahr and Nihal, please drop them in the chat. Till then, I think we have a question from our team for Professor Nihal Perera. Is he here?
I don't see the question. Do you see?
Oh, okay.
Is
No,
it in
the
chat?
question was from our team, and it's, do buildings within the nature, such as a building on a hill, also compromise integrity within these nature foundations, and how feasible is this practice, and is it a concern um, when talking about population density increasing? So
I didn't get it. Building on a hill is what?
I think the question is asking to how feasible is it to be building at, with nature as foundation?
I think you can try to understand this from a number of different ways. I think in a historical sense, I think in South Asia, it's not very difficult to understand that that people used to build with nature. I mean, that's one of the sources. That doesn't mean that's the only way. Actually, if I may refer to what I know the best, that is in Sri Lanka and so on, people did not build. I mean, in my own book, I argue the view and so on were not commodified at some point. That doesn't necessarily mean we have to go back, like as I said earlier. So we can actually try to understand, so that was not the purpose. That's, like, I mean, they did believe that we are a part of the nature and so on. So there were sometimes, like the gods and so on lived on the hills, right? So I'm not sure uh, when it when the question is about feasibility. What kind of feasibility? I mean, is it financial? In regard to financial feasibility, also, like, I mean, when I was going to school, we were told that the land values were very high in the middle of the city, like Manhattan or downtown Chicago. Therefore, the buildings were going tall, and so on. Actually, absolute nonsense, because because after deindustrialization, right in the middle of Chicago, you can see like four-storied apartment housing, right? So these are all like, I mean, when the stockyards uh, uh, left the city and so on. So I think cities and everything so like goes in cycles. There's I don't think there's one knowledge that will stick forever, but if you want to kind of like understand the connection between hill and living and that kind of stuff, I think there are different sources. One being local, and the other one being actually how people pay. In the West, the money and the commodification is very is prime. So building on a hill, overlooking the entire colony as they did in after colonialism, I mean, that has a lot of value. And I think we need to come to some terms with that.
Thank you, Professor Nihal. I have a question for you.
Yeah,
Your book,
please.
Decolonizing Ceylon, shows how the British era street grids and zoning stayed in place after independence. But
Right.
given that legacy, why do informal settlements still emerge on the fringes of carefully planned capitals, for example, Islamabad in Pakistan and Chandigarh?
I think you took a very interesting question or focus, because if you go to if you go to Chandigarh, I mean, it shows the dilemma. Like, I mean, I have written a piece on Chandigarh. Like, and I have highlighted this because Chandigarh is a so-called a modernist city, right? I mean, Corbusier himself was the planner, right? And then according to the Siam declaration, uh, it's so well planned that nobody else can live there. Right. It's only for the planned people. It's a what do you call, administrative city. So even the people who constructed the city had to leave after construction. So it's so well planned, right? So what happens? They don't leave. So and they built. If you look at Chandigarh, you have the head where the main buildings are, which is actually the capital complex and so on, and then the government workers of various grades, and then at the end you have a so-called informal settlement. But as I try to highlight, informal does not come after formal. I mean, this is, I think, also a mistake that we have. People used to live before formal ever existed. Right. I mean, there may be some formalities that the kings kind of like try to kind of like exercise and so on, but people lived in rural areas and various other areas. So all of a sudden we say we have something called formal, and everything else becomes informal. So I don't think people are building informal. People are just continuing their lives, which we continue to call informal, I think. So I think we have to come to terms with this. We can't just keep continuing to kind of call it informal. As I said, again, I have also written about Dharavi as well as Vanathamula, which is a similar place in Colombo. When people are moved from these so-called informal settlements to uh, flats, it doesn't really work because the flat life, it's a different lifestyle. They earn money, they pay bills, and so on and so on. So when people are selling popsicles and books in buses and so on for their lives, so if they don't have the money, they can actually spend one night without food, and because their focus is not on paying bills, their focus is on their livelihood, right? But if you're in a flat, you have to pay the bills, otherwise the authorities are going to come right at you and sort of like block water, block electricity, and make your life hell. So poverty in a what you call the informal place becomes chronic poverty that you cannot even get out of. So I don't know whether I responded to you. Is that what you asked, though?
Yeah, you answered my question. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so now we have a question for Sahr in the chat. Sahr, do you think the contrast of, sorry, what do you think the contrast of Haya March and Aurat March shows how women are publicly politicized? And on what basis do you know the Haya March doesn't get policed as much as Aurat March, even though both are inherently doing the same thing, claiming public space?
Okay, so I did respond to it in the chat as well, but I would love to elaborate as well. So the firstly, I would like to ask whoever typed the question to elaborate what do they mean by policed and give me an insight of what they're exactly trying to ask.
I've been participating in Earth March personally for the last 3 years. And as freeing the act of like claiming public spaces, dancing in the fall is as it is, but you see the we are constantly surrounded by police. I have never seen that much police deployed in any of the protests that have been. Specifically, the kind of police that you see on a Palestine protest or a Baloch protest or a march. Other than that, you don't see similar policing happening for Hayamart specifically. Instead, it is kind of like praised in terms of like this anti-feminist like body that is being now coming out, and it's like, oh, this is great, and this is also you see that the Earth March is not a political party, and it is not a political body in like a I would say documented sense. like it doesn't interfere with the state, but instead Haya March is usually financed or I would say proposed by Jamaat Islami specifically. And it's a Jamiyat project, which I think becomes a lot more interesting because then you see that now they're directly interfering with the state politics as well. But because the women are in burqas, they are favored. There's no heavy policing. Ki jo diagram between itself, you don't see show police on the Hayamart side. You specifically show the barricades and the police on the Orithmart side, and I think that was very informative itself. So that's what I mean by policing. I hope you get the point.
And I understand your question much better now. So, first of all, the diagram that I proposed, it's not an actual snapshot of any actual instances. It's based on the information that I got from different newspapers and how the the blogs and vlogs that have been put forward by the participants of Aurat March and how it's been documented in the news. And according to those accounts, a lot of times while Aurat March is unable to proceed past the press club, the plot that's outside the press club, Haya March is able to march all the way to D Chowk, and maybe not march, but just gather there and occupy that particular space. So, but the reason for it not being policed is because while Aurat March, the intent is to unsettle the existing structures. So the and on the other hand, Haya March as a counter march which takes place in reaction to Aurat March, the intent there is to consolidate the structures that exist, which kind of makes it understandable why one of the marches needs to be policed and the other does not.
I think, yeah, thank you so much for that. But a last note that I would like to add is, I think this is really interesting because I think it is also very fun that women are ultimately claiming public spaces, even if they are upholding the current hegemony, जो आपकी है, state hegemony लगा लें, patriarchal hegemony, whatever. But as the act, women are on the streets, whatever politicizing is happening, whatever political ideas they're proposing. But I think Aurat March has now led to this idea, chahe uski counter hi aa raha hai, but women are on the streets, they're talking about their own politics in whatever way. And I think that's what women, Aurat March specifically has been able to achieve in Pakistan specifically. Yeah, thank you so much, Sahr. This was really informative.
So much for your comment.
Okay, so we have another question for you. So in Karachi, Aurat March happens in Fair Hall Gardens, an already dominant civil public space. How do you think that is different in confronting state narratives as a march happening in front of Parliament Square?
That's a very interesting question. That's something that I eventually do hope to address in my research as well. So both the cities, they're morphologically very different. They have very different spatial histories. They have very different social histories, and they also have very different political histories as well. And because of that, how the cities afford not just Aurat March to take place, but in general how protest can take place in these two different cities with very different histories, where top-down control of space is very different. It has in general shaped the access to the public. In instance of Karachi, the protest is taking place in parks. In Islamabad, there is no such park, which is able to gain the same amount of visibility, or would be able to have the similar level of eyes on it if it's planned in one of the parks in the sectors or even in F9 parks. So it becomes important for the march in Islamabad to occupy the space outside the parliament square, or at least pushed to occupy this space, because there is no other way for them to gain the same kind of visibility, just because of how the city is structured. But honestly, I I wish I could give a better answer at this point for how Bharat March in Karachi, and or what it says about citizenship in these two different cities. But I think it's these layers of political, social, and cultural history which is shaping the same march differently in the two different cities.
Can I add something to Asad's previous question as well as this? Actually, like these are really connected, Asad, because I think space, we were told, like, I mean, again, somebody wrote something really nicely, Mushi wrote, cities are being designed not for the people living there, but based on the idea of what a city should be. It's kind of like normative, it follows theories rather than people, right? I mean, this is where we can get to Chandigarh as well. And also what Sahr was talking about, when a space is planned, it is totally unsuccessful if nobody uses it, right? That's number one. Then the issue is when people use it, they expect it to be used in the same way that was designed, right? Then it is also unsuccessful. The issue is there is no way that the ordinary people, even the people who built so-called informal settlements in Chandigarh or the protesters that Sahr is talking about, will actually now ask, why did you design this space? Now I'm going to use it in the same way, right? There's no way that it can happen. So this is what I would call the abstract space. The design and planning happens at the abstract level. This is a park. This is a road. The road becomes a real road when people start selling stuff or not selling stuff, or when the police wins against the vendors, like whatever. So there's a huge negotiation on the ground before the space becomes that particular space, space in practice, if you want to call it lived space, like to put it that way. So this abstract space needs to transform into lived space. So the people who occupy are not the same people who went to school and sort of like learned about these concepts of, like this is how it used, needs to be used. So when we design a park, maybe mothers might use that to bring children. Maybe drug dealers can use that to, have drugs. So we never know what this park is going to become. So I think where we lose track of is kind of like we it's very hard for us to know what it's going to be, because we only have an abstract name for this. This is a park, this is a road, this is a Capitol building, whatever. So I think it's really interesting for me to kind of like listen to Sarah as well, to see how the state might have wanted this space to be used, which is in very abstract public space. This is how it is. Yeah, of course, this is the public space. Now we are going to use it this way, right? And so on. So abstract space, in my People Spaces book, I argue abstract space has to fail before it succeeds. It's a dilemma. Because there's a gap between the concepts that are used to design the abstract space and the lived space. So this has to fail because these people come from different places. Even when Colombo was built, when people came to occupy the colonial Colombo, people came from villages. They didn't know what the colonials were thinking. So they will build, like whatever they want to build and so on. So for the colonials, okay, now we want them to come, but we don't like what they're doing, So this is the failure. So this has to fail. So abstract space, there's a gap between abstract space and lived space always, all the time. Number one. Number two, abstract space has to fail before it succeeds. And for the people who designed abstract space, it's very hard because they think it's a failure, right? Now they have to now negotiate, like in Zaha's case, with police or not police or whatever, like I mean, there's a very different negotiation. the negotiation is not made only by the occupiers of the space, but also by the creators, right? I mean, once I was in I was teaching at CEPT, university in Ahmedabad, and my friend, colleague, the dean, took me to Hyderabad, where he did a plan for the periphery, and then the commissioner was asking some questions, and then I was sitting, like I was a peripheral guy because I was from outside, and I was kind of like watching this, and then the commissioner said, "You know what? You need to tell me exactly what this plan is about, because first of all, the politicians have to accept this. It should be economically feasible, and then it will be negotiated on the ground, whether it's going to succeed or not, right? So, yeah, hope that's
Yeah,
useful.
exactly. Like when I give like a brief overview of how Islamabad was really conceived, and so this particular space where Aurat March is pushing to appear eventually, like it was conceived as a space of state authority, but
Right,
uh, over the years, different sorts of protests take place, and they transform this space of state authority into a space of political resistance. But that space of political resistance still remains a very masculine space. But
right,
over the past 6 to 7 years, this particular movement that I'm looking at, Aurat March, they want to transform that masculine space of resistance into a feminist space of resistance as well. So it's always the conceived and abstract and lived space. Like it all goes uh, hand in hand, and it's not static. That's how the abstract space was designed, and that's how it's going to stay for the rest of its life. So
right. Space is never going to remain as a product. Space is
yeah,
always a process, because
yeah,
it's, like, it's contested, it's transformed, it's negotiated, not only by people, but also by the police. So this is why in my work I focus on space as a process, which you are doing as well,
yeah,
not as a product, because it's not like given. Now this is how it's going to be. No, it's never.
yeah.
Okay, thank you, Nihal and Sahr, for your thoughtful and very responsive reflections. It's been a pleasure having you two here. I'm now going to hand it over to our curator, Samir, who is going to conclude the session.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sehan and Asad, for moderating this session. And thank you so much to our lovely speakers, Nihal and Sahr. We really learned a lot from your talk regarding gender in space, regarding social and class values that are in space, and how these are being tackled in our post-colonial environments, and how better we can approach these issues. And also what Anoma and Ammara talked about earlier regarding how the economic imperialism is still rampant in global south, and how we can sort of move forward with this. And this has been a session of great learning, and I hope all of our participants also enjoyed this. And we thank everyone to joining us at a weekday. And our next session is going to be on Wednesday, and it is about, again, decoloniality, and we engage with art and architecture as symbols of decolonization in that session. And I hope everyone, including you, will join that. Thank you so much for being here. Goodbye.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Thank you so much for organizing this.
Thank you.